Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the South Korea-US Alliance in Focus, a three-session online conference that will examine the current status of the ROK-US Alliance, explore challenges, and discuss future directions. My name is David Fields, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This conference was made possible through the generous support of the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Chicago. This first session, entitled Plans, Not Predictions, will explore issues related to the future reunification of Korea, not in an attempt to predict when this might happen, but rather to highlight what planning can be done in advance to ensure stability on the Korean peninsula and in the US-ROK alliance. To discuss this today, we have three outstanding panelists with decades of experience exploring this and other issues in the alliance. To fully introduce them would take the entire amount of time we have today, so I will introduce them very quickly, but links to their full bios can be found on the conference webpage at eastasia.wisc.edu/KORUS. Rüdiger Frank is Professor of East Asian Economy and Society and head of the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Vienna. He holds an MA in Korean Studies, Economics, and International Relations, and a PhD in Economics. In 1991, he spent one semester as a language student at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang and has been researching North Korea ever since. His major research fields are socialist transformation in East Asia, with a focus on North Korea, state business relations in East Asia, and regional integration in East Asia. Mr. Bryan is currently the Deputy Director of the Commanders Action Group of U.S. Army Future Command. Prior to joining the Futures Command, Mr. Port served as the Director of Strategy for U.S. Forces Korea from 2009 to 2017. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California at Santa Cruz and a master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University, and is currently pursuing a PhD in history at the University of Texas at Austin. Ambassador Kathleen Stevens is president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Stevens first served in Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer and trainer from 1975 to 1977. She returned to Korea in 1983 as a U.S. Foreign Service officer and held many postings in Korea, eventually serving as U.S. ambassador from 2008 to 2011. Ambassador Stevens has held many academic appointments, including at Stanford, Georgetown, and the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul. She also received numerous awards recognizing her work as a diplomat, including the Presidential Meritorious Service Award in the United States and the Kwanghwa Medal of Diplomatic Merit given by the President of the ROK. But before we get to our presentations today, I would like to welcome Dr. Yong-Suk Kim, Consul General of the Republic of Korea in Chicago, to give some opening remarks. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kim.
Thank you. Thank you, Associate Director David Field, distinguished speakers, Professor Rüdiger Frank, fellow Bryan Port, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, and guests. It is my privilege to co-host this online conference with the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus to discuss the Korea-US alliance and Korea's foreign policy at critical moment of geopolitical shift. This webinar is a part of public diplomacy activity in the Midwest by the Korean Consul General in Chicago. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the University of Wisconsin and its faculty and students for continuing to raise awareness of Korea on campus, as well as preparing this event in cooperation with the Korean Consul General in Chicago. This conference, under the title of South Korea US alliance in focus is timely and significant because we can assess the current state of bilateral relationship and security environment in the Indo-Pacific and explore ways forward based on the results of the summit meeting between President Moon and President Biden held in DC last May, and the ongoing development of strategic importance in the region. The summit shows that Korea-US cooperation is still strong and growing, widely noted as a huge success, and restored and reinvigorate the alliance, expanding the depth and scope of cooperation in areas of not just security and peace, but also economy and technology, health, and climate change, and so on. In particular, the two leaders confirmed their agreement to ensure peace and denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, reaffirming their support for diplomacy and dialogue based on their government's previous commitment. They also agreed to closely coordinate their approach to North Korea. Amid this strong alliance and the changing geopolitical landscape, I hope this conference, which will be held over 3 sessions, will be a useful opportunity to analyze the current situation and find ways to foster stronger ties between our two countries and develop a more peaceful and prosperous region. I look forward to dynamic and constructive discussion from renowned panelists so that we can collect insight and wisdom for an ever-strengthening partnership and a more secure and stable region. I hope you are doing well and staying healthy in this pandemic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for those welcomes and for your support of this conference and of hopefully exploring these topics that will be of great interest to all of us, both the panelists and in the audience. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Rüdiger Frank of the University of Vienna for his presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Fields. And let me just say very briefly that it's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished panel and to have a chance to share some of my thoughts on a topic that is particularly dear to me. By my accent, you might already guess that I'm German. So I went through German Unification, and being also a Korea guy, obviously that's a topic I've been thinking about a lot. And I'm going to share some of my thoughts with you that are slightly eccentric, or at least not mainstream. So I hope they are at least inspiring for your thinking. And yes, but we will see. So the title is Challenging the Korean Fear of High Costs. And this is what I'm trying to do now. Okay, well, you know that after 1990, actually, many Koreans rushed to Germany to study unification. And they returned with mainly one lesson, and that was, oh, this is going to be super expensive. I would say this short sentence already includes 2 major mistakes. One is that it actually does make sense to look at Germany's example to learn something for Korea. I'm highly skeptical of that idea, and I've written extensively on it. Below on this slide, you see 2 sources available online where I list, I think, about 25 or more reasons why that doesn't work. But today I'm going to focus on error number 2, and that is this very idea that German unification has been enormously costly, especially for West Germany, because I strongly believe that this has not been the case. Now, this is a very short presentation today. Mr. Fields does have a PDF of this publication that you see here, and it's perfectly fine. If you want to have it, you just get in touch with him, and he will send you a PDF, or you just write me an email, and I'm happy to send you this as well in case you want to read it in more detail. Okay, so imagine you are a South Korean and you read any of these quotes that I have here, and this is obviously not a complete collection, but just a selection, and they all sound very dramatic. I mean, we talk about trillions of dollars or euros. The numbers, they vary quite a lot, but the message is very clear. This is really, really scary. And if you look at the last quote there at the very bottom, you also feel a little bit of a political subtone here. It's not just that all this money has been spent, it was mainly wasted. So it's been a huge effort and nothing really came out of it. So that is, I think, one of the dominant narratives about German unification. And then, of course, Koreans immediately think, okay, and this is going to apply to us as well. I think you are all aware of the surveys that are taking place. In Korea, there are many of them. Two most prominent ones, perhaps, by Korea Institute of National Unification and Seoul National University. And the trend over the years is actually pretty obvious. Things are getting worse in a way. The younger generation in particular becomes more and more skeptical of unification. And if you look for the reasons, economic concerns really are at the very center. That makes sense. South Korea is having economic difficulties for a number of reasons, and nobody in that situation also wants to have the extra burden of having to pay for North Korea, if you follow this analogy with Germany. Why does that matter? It does matter because obviously South Korea is a democracy, and if its citizens do not want unification, then of course the political forces will have to react. And I think this is also where we have this connection to the larger theme of this series here, the ROK-US alliance. If South Korea is supposed to engage in certain policies towards North Korea that might lead to unification, then those concerns over problems in case it really happens clearly matter also in terms of looking at it from that perspective. Okay, but let me start with my conclusion. My main argument, so to say, economically, German unification did not result in losses for West Germany. Actually, it resulted in net gains. You notice that I wrote economically because the whole matter is, of course, a bit more complex. There are other sides of this whole story that need to be considered. So you could argue that socially or strategically or something, there have been losses, but economically, financially, that is clearly not the case. And as an East German, I can also say with full conviction that it has been a win-win situation for both sides. So I really can't see too many people who really lost, and definitely not economically. Therefore, if you believe that the German example does matter for Korea, I already said I do not really, but I know that many of you do, then at least from that example, high unification costs in Korea are simply not to be expected, on the contrary. And I will now spend the rest of my time to explain how I come to this very bizarre conclusion that is, I guess, pretty different from what you have read and heard so far. Okay, let's imagine we are sitting in front of a screen and we watch what's happening in a room through a security camera. There are two people and the vending machine, and this is basically it. One person, let's call him or her West, gives the other person East, $10. East then goes to the vending machine, spends these $10 on whatever. And our obvious conclusion, and how could that be wrong? West loses $10, right? I mean, we have seen it. The $10 have been passed on to the next person. This is how this would look like in terms of German unification. So you have pretty sophisticated statistics. What kind of money did flow from what account to East Germany? You have funds from the central state, from the federal states, from various authorities like the labor authority, pension insurance, and so on. What matters is this number here that I circled in red, 627 billion Deutschmarks. Like in US dollars, you cut it about by half to give you a better idea of what that is. And this is just for the years 1991 to 94. I stay with those years because there it's easier to really identify these transfers as actually unification related. Later, the whole thing becomes a bit more blurred, but it's really the first years where this unification effect is pretty obvious and clear. And I think that's also the years that most people in Korea are really concerned about. Okay, so that is that story as we know it, I think. And that's what really most people actually see when they think about German unification. Now, some people are a bit smarter and wonder that vending machine, you know, aren't there any taxes that are supposed to be paid? So the East German guy enters $10, but he doesn't get the value of $10 out, right? He gets, let's say, $8, and the rest is kept by the state in terms of value-added tax or sales tax or something. But that still means, you know, that the West loses $8, right? In the actual statistics, this is called so-called net transfers to East Germany. This is becoming a bit more interesting, depending on what kind of taxes and fees, etc., you include that are actually flowing back. So they are transferred to East Germany, but then people pay tax, they pay insurance premiums, and so on. So you have various values. I have two data here. That's the German Institute for Economic Research, a very prestigious economic research institute, and that's the Ministry of Finance of Germany. So it's the same time period, 91 to 94. And suddenly you see that this big scary number, 627 billion, gets a bit smaller, actually in some estimates cut by half, but it's still quite a lot of money, right? So what is the big deal? Well, the big deal is coming now. Because going back to our room with these two people, actually the West loses exactly nothing, because West also owns the vending machine. And West doesn't just own the vending machine. West also owns the company that produces all the sandwiches and the chocolate bars, and that imports all the soft drinks that are then going into the vending machine. And in fact, West doesn't just lose nothing because all the money is flowing back to it anyway, but it makes money because East doesn't just have these $10 he received from West, but he also has some savings, and of course he's working. So he's getting a little bit of money and he has to spend it on something, right? So West actually gained something. These numbers are, of course, purely hypothetical. That's just to give you an idea of what has really happened. And this is how I conclude that both sides are actually winning. You know, West makes a financial gain, and East also gains something because the transfers are real, right? So everyone's happy. Okay, now comes the skepticism, like, okay, funny analogy, but does that really work? Yeah, I think it does, actually. East Germans did spend a lot of money at the West German vending machine, in quotation marks. Why? Because they needed to eat something and they needed to live somewhere. That's pretty obvious. Supermarkets, housing, it's all owned by Western companies or by the state, which is the origin of all these transfers. There was hardly any private ownership of housing, especially when it comes to larger scales. I mean, we're not talking about a small house for one family, but even there, the ratio of people living in such houses was very low. And then East Germans, if you're familiar with this whole thing, after unification, there was a big consumer tendency. You know, people bought whatever they couldn't buy the years before. Again, I'm also speaking out of my own experience here: cars, electronics, textiles, travel, etc., etc. None of that was produced in East Germany, almost zero. In fact, they bought milk and bread imported from West Germany in the first years after unification, not because they didn't produce that at home, but nobody wanted to spend, you know, hard currency on products that they could have bought earlier for their Eastern Deutschmark. That was a very interesting psychological effect, right? So this vending machine analogy actually works. Also, if you look at this number, that's actually quite interesting. Weren't there any East German vending machines? Actually, the answer is no. 35,000 contracts have been signed by the privatization agency, or Treuhand, if you're familiar with this process. 84% in this whole privatization drive where East Germany was kind of converted into actual property rights through the state agency. 84% were signed by West Germans, only 3% went to East German investors. And do not misunderstand me, I'm not saying this to complain or something, that's simply a fact. And by the way, the remainder went to third countries like France, the UK, the United States a little bit, and so on and so on. So there was virtually nothing being produced in East Germany that these transfers could be spent on. And you also see what happened to employment. That's kind of another side of the same coin. All the producers were basically gone. Manufacturing, down, agriculture down, only services actually flourished. Okay, very often you hear the argument, yeah, but all this money went into infrastructure, into East German infrastructure, and haven't the Autobahn and the telecommunication networks, etc., been built? Doesn't that count as costs of unification? Basically sunk costs because it all happened in East Germany. Well, who built all these things? If you went in your car along the Autobahn, I did a lot from Berlin to Leipzig, you saw all these signs by construction companies basically spending these transfers. These were all West German construction companies. So all the money went there, generated or secured jobs there, generated profits there, and basically was a Keynesian demand boost of gigantic dimensions, that would never ever be possible under normal political conditions. Who used or uses these Autobahn now? Individuals who travel a lot. Were those East Germans in the very beginning? Typically not, because if you're poor, and you must be in order to receive transfers, you don't really travel that much. And companies, if you talk about more commercial transport, which East German companies, right? So that's also a very interesting question. It's not just has the Autobahn or the highway been built, but who uses it? For whom is it beneficial? There's a number of other thoughts on that, but I'll just skip this and move on because I guess you are getting the idea. Yes, we are at our room with the vending machine again. You've seen this slide before. I'm just going to show you the numbers now to also show you that this is not just some weird speculation on my side working with all these funny images, but there are numbers to actually prove that. And here we are. Germany has a strong federal structure. So there are statistics on trade between single federal states. And some colleagues were able to actually compile these numbers and came up with exports and imports from East Germany to West Germany and vice versa. And what you see here, again, this is our time period from 91 to 94, and that's the total number here, is that obviously East German federal states after unification exported much less to West Germany than they imported from West Germany. And that's actually the balance here. So for those 4 years, it's 717 billion Deutschmarks. If we now contrast that to the transfers, the thing becomes really interesting. I mean, you can easily discard the first number here because this is without considering taxes. So you can decide whether you would like 474 or 340 something. The answer is always the same thing. It's a net financial gain that the West German part or the federal state actually made out of this. And this is why I argue that this has been a financial gain, not a financial loss. And I'm pretty sure something similar might happen in South Korea as well. Okay, but what about reality? You know, didn't Germany enter a huge economic crisis after unification? Does that make sense? You know, if they make all these gains and then suddenly they have a crisis? Well, what crisis? Look at these numbers. I understand the first two are nominal GDP, okay. So let's just look at real GDP growth. That's nominal GDP minus inflation rate. And you see, Germany has actually been, that's all of Germany taken together, including East Germany. So you see, they only had the 1993 where this went down to minus 1%. But look at France. France in the same year had minus 0.6%. So, and they didn't have a unification. So frankly, Germany has been doing remarkably well in this regard. So there has been no crisis, which again confirms my conclusion that actually financially, that was not the disaster as which it is being displayed all the time, and in particular in South Korea. Okay, to summarize this, and I'm at the end of my presentation now, the figures for East-West transfers are sometimes inflated because you forget about taxes that were flowing back. Profits of Western companies generated thanks to those transfers are totally ignored, although they are real. I think the actual costs of German unification to the West German economy were much lower. And in fact, West Germany recorded a net financial gain, making German unification a win-win situation. And my key conclusion, yes, there might have been a redistribution of wealth from the West German taxpayer to the West German corporate sector. This is a possibility, but certainly not a redistribution of wealth from West to East. That's just not there. The Korean public, I do believe that, has many very good reasons to worry about the economic effects of unification, including economic effects. But the German example clearly is not a good case to support such arguments, and especially not concerning unification costs. And with this, I conclude and thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Frank, for that very interesting presentation that I know challenged many of the narratives that I constantly read about the cost of unification. And I meant it in my introduction that I could only scratch the surface of all of our presenters' bios. So please go to our website where you can find more of Dr. Frank's work. Contact me if you're interested in receiving the larger piece that he mentioned. And he also appeared on the NK News podcast this January with my good friend Jacko Svetlut and gave a wonderful, wide-ranging interview going into his personal bio as well as these arguments that he's making. So please do check that out again. Now, if we could move on to our next presenter, Bryan Port. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David, for actually putting this together. It's not often these days that I get to kind of delve back into issues that involve Korea because I've got my head and my responsibilities sort of in another arena. I do have to mention really quickly that my views today are only my own. They're not in any way, shape, or form necessarily representative of or contrary to, any policies that the United States government has or has had. It is a great opportunity to be here. I'm familiar with Professor Frank's work, but I've never actually had a chance to meet or interact with him before. So today is a banner day, at least in that regard. And it's also a banner day in regards to being on a panel with Ambassador Stevens, who I did know and interact with in Korea many years ago. In fact, I was recalling an interesting session we had with this group called the Elders. I don't know if you remember that, with former President Carter and some other former heads of state. One of the more unusual interactions in my career up until this point. And at the Consul General in Chicago, which is actually my hometown, is another place to express some gratitude toward for bringing us together. We I don't think talk about this aspect of Korean affairs nearly enough. Professor Frank, you made a number of very interesting points, and I definitely like a sort of an alternative perspective, because over the practically, I think, or almost 15 total years I spent in Korea, you just consistently heard the German example brought forward, and it never struck me as a particularly apt example, just because of all the differences that exist from one place to another. It's worth studying and learning from, I suppose, but with some caution, I think. And so that point is very much appreciated. I partly understood maybe what you were saying in terms of it's not a cost per se in the German case, but it was more of an investment or a stimulus is partly what I understood the case to be in terms of what the investments from the West were for the East. And as you, I believe, alluded to, Professor Frank, that may not be the case in Korea. And I think that's definitely worth bearing in mind. But before I launch into the heart of my presentation, another idea that Professor Frank kind of, I think, brought to the fore in a sense that I want to focus in on for a second is this idea of, is unification a choice? In the strictest sense, I suppose, is a political construct about whether the two countries come together, it's a choice. But if there's a war or a collapse scenario, it's less of a choice. It may not be that you ultimately affect unification, but you cannot, in a sense, when you're right there next to each other, escape the consequences, especially if it's a fairly severe situation. Now, my presentation, I was going to give you just a few points, really three areas. One, context of why I wrote the article that I think brought me to Dave's attention for this particular session. It was an article in the Military Review about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm going to talk for a moment or two about the article itself and then just update my thoughts on it from when I wrote it some 6 or so years ago to now. So the context was that the command where I was working at the time thought it would be good to encourage some of its folks to get out there and write in a few publications, and not quite as constrained by what the actual plans or policies may or may not have been at the time, but just to introduce some other subjects into the discourse, especially amongst military audiences. And this was the military review. It's the Army's kind of U.S. Army's premier intellectual journal, if you will. There, in that kind of article, in that kind of audience, you know, if you know your audience, you shape the article for the audience. So the article I wrote was definitely very military centric, overly so, even from my own thoughts or perspectives on the issue. But again, it's trying to address this from the vantage point of how military officers and civil servants would look at this set of issues. So the article itself has a particular focus, a prism through which it looks at the issue. The article itself, I introduced this idea of a 7P strategy. There are 7 elements. I'll just rattle them off really quick. Politics, public support, prediction, policy, plans, preparation, and prompting, what some people might think of maybe as shaping or influencing. And in the article, I tried to focus mostly on politics and on, or rather on policy, I should say, and preparation. I kind of honed in on those 2 aspects of things. Without the political resolution, in a sense, to do something differently or more, you're not going to really see very concerted action, much concerted action from the government. On the contrary, you could see the government constrain private organizations or other, international organizations from involving themselves in more of what we might see as a proactive way. So you would have to get the policies right, and then you look at that construct I laid out. And one of the things you can most control is what your own preparations are. And if you're very worried about things like high costs, whether it's from a collapse scenario or just a crisis in which your nation, be it South Korea or somebody else, decides it wants to contribute to try and resolve or alleviate, if you don't have the adequate or proper methods and talent sets and materials in place, amongst other things, you're just simply not able to contribute the way that you might have wanted to, or the way that might be most effective or most efficient. And with different types of crises, you know, it's not simply the case that food is as fungible or money is as fungible as we might like to think. You know, time is a factor which will constrain the ability to use money, and it may not be a food crisis. It could be a medical issue. So, you know, I bring those 2 examples up because I think they're some of the most common ways that we think about immediate assistance to some area of the world that might be in trouble. You have people who are starving, need medical supplies, or, you know, it might be a financial crisis. Those are some of the more common ways. But I think if you were to focus on preparation, you can look at certain things that you know are going to be required in some future scenario where either you have a collapse and or reunification, or North Korea maybe eventually changes its political system and opens up and needs help to try and set things onto a productive path. So you can, I think, plan against those things. And there may be a good deal of that going on, for example, in the Ministry of Unification in South Korea, amongst the militaries, so on and so forth. Obviously, because of my background, I can't go into detail about those things, about what may or may not be occurring. But there's certainly that possibility. There's also the concern that any overt efforts in this regard would prompt a backlash from North Korea, because it could be seen as very threatening by them, especially if you're moving forward and saying you intend to destabilize them, or you intend to bring this set of circumstances about, which I do not believe is the case for either South Korea or the United States. There, to be sure, is economic pressure due to the weapons of mass destruction issue, and or sometimes with respect to human rights, but that kind of is the extent of how proactive, if you will, those policies tend to be. They, on the contrary, tend to be much more about deterrence and defense than anything else. And as Professor Frank, I think, alluded to as well, the level of support within South Korea for unification is much different now, for example, than when I went to Korea for the first time way back in the 90s. So there again is another aspect of it. You just probably aren't likely to get that sense of pressure on the government to be more proactive, either in South Korea or even arguably the United States, or it comes through a prism that isn't exactly helpful. This is kind of where I get into the update part, where you look at things like North Korean efforts and weapons of mass destruction or human rights abuses, and you know that's where you get some public pressure to alter government policies and try to become more proactive, is my sense of the 2 main drivers, you know, at present in both South Korea and the United States and in many other nations. It doesn't seem to me though that would be a particularly productive way to sort of take those two concerns several steps further to try and actually prompt some sort of a significant, dramatic political change in North Korea. That's I guess the paradox here is you see the problem get worse over time in terms of what the suffering of the North Korean people, for example, holds, in store for them. And you wish to, in some cases, do something now to alleviate or even try to set things on a better path. You, of course, don't want to assist the regime. You have the weapons of mass destruction issue in particular comes into play, makes it even harder. And you wind up in this dynamic where you're just not able to do very much that's proactive at all. You're worried about risking a backlash. You're, trying to figure out where your political will lies in terms of what you will do and for how long you'll sustain it. And it kind of leaves you in what I would describe as a not exactly paralysis, but you're not really moving forward very quickly to try and affect change. In no small measure, because the kind of change that might come about could be incredibly destructive and just laden with a lot of risks from conflict, a lot of risks from the changed strategic dynamics in Northeast Asia from whatever that conflict may hold in store, which of course also has a bearing on the economic costs that would be involved or benefits, depending on what time horizons you're looking at. Over time, unified Korea holds a lot of potential. If I recall, there's a Goldman Sachs study from some number of years ago now that talked about Korea's economic potential in terms of how much more it could move up in the ranks of, the largest economies of the world based upon that unification taking place, obviously, among certain parameters. So you have an incredibly complex issue. And I'll just kind of conclude on this idea that within that complexity, there are certain things that you can foresee as likely to be major issues in a crisis or in a unification scenario. Some of them would be immediate. Some of them would be more of a long-lasting, a long-term kind of issue. And to me, if you only even chose a few of those and invested yourself in thinking through them, and even maybe provisioning, if not supplies, in a sense of materials, at least the human talent and the connectivity between organizations, such that if this were to unfold, they would have a better starting point. Not just in terms of a plan on paper, but in terms of, and if you've been with the military before, you know that in a sense we train and we plan not because the actual training or plan itself is really important, but that process that you go through is, because it brings people together that have to work together and get some acclimated to one another and to a dynamic. And so that in the earliest hours of a contingent situation, they're not trying to get to know each other. They're not trying to begin to build trust. They're not trying to just get their heads around the entirety of the issue. They've already got a starting point and they've already got relationships to draw. And that sort of a thing can be incredibly powerful. And I think also those kinds of preparations can happen below a threshold at which the North Koreans might otherwise react. And others too. I mean, the Chinese, for example, would be none too happy if there were an overt, even the Japanese perhaps would not be too happy. There was some overt destabilization effort, for example, or effort to bring dramatic, even call it positive change, to the conditions in North Korea. So I think I'm pretty much at the limit of my time. It's an important topic. It's important to think about preparing, I think, for a future that you're anticipating more so than strictly predicting it and setting in motion based on your prediction, concrete actions that are meant to base themselves on a result you're seeking in a situation that currently exists that begins to change from the very moment that you initiate a concerted effort, a strategy. So again, thank you for everybody's time and participation. I'll look forward to hearing from Ambassador Stevens and seeing what comes from the remainder of the time.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Port. And if anyone is curious, I've put a link to the piece that Bryan was talking about. You can find it in the chat. And as we welcome Ambassador Stevens, I encourage you to start preparing your questions. We'll have some time for questions after these. And you can please type them directly into the chat or use the Q&A function on this webinar to ask your questions. So Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, Professor Fields, David, thank you. It's great to see you. I guess one of the few sort of silver linings of this time we've been in is to meet you virtually and to see the great work that you're doing in Wisconsin, and to join the consulate in Chicago virtually as well. I remember visiting your consulate some years ago and look forward to being back again. And of course, I'm happy to be on this panel because I really do admire the work of Dr. Frank. Bryan, who's been such a great advisor to an expert on the Korean Peninsula, to a succession of US military and civilian figures over the years. So I hope I can be fairly brief because I would like to have a conversation with the panel and with the audience. I guess I have to say, even though I've been out of government for a long time, that I'm going to speak, I guess, from the perspective of having had a career in US diplomacy and in the US government, and try to bring that practitioner perspective, as you academics call it sometimes. But I'm not speaking for the US government. I'm speaking entirely of my own kind of renegade thoughts as I've started my second career. But I thought I'd say something about actually the division of Korea, because I think that whether you're in government or in academia or you're a member of the Korean or the American public, the division happened so long ago that we kind of forget that the reason we're talking about reunification is because there actually was the division. I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of how would U.S. diplomacy and Bryan's talked a little bit to the military perspective, look at this question of plans and predictions. I'm glad you said plans, not predictions. I'm not sure that U.S. diplomacy has been very good at either. But how does that, what are our limitations and what do we need to do in that area? And finally, given that, what would be the principles and priorities that we might, as the United States or as other countries, as friends, bring to inter-Korean relations, the future of the Korean Peninsula? I think that's the big question that's really before us. But first of all, I mean, with respect to the division of Korea, I'm not going to go down a long historical narrative here, but yeah, I'm struck by how people who come into these issues without the chronological age or long experience that perhaps some have, think that this has been forever. And again, maybe that reflects a little bit of public attitudes about it. But of course, the division of Korea was considered to be temporary, like a lot of lines that are drawn by great powers and through other circumstances. It was done through no fault of the Korean people, and in an area that did enjoy, as we all know who knows something about Korea, a rather extraordinary historical continuity as a unified state, by however one wants to define that, linguistic, cultural, historical. But a division then solidified in 1948 with the establishment of the two rival regimes supported by opposing states, and then of course the hot war of 1950 to 1953, followed by the Cold War. So I say that because you mentioned, David, I arrived in Korea about 20 years after the Korean War ended in an armistice. And I taught in the South Korea in a boys' middle school, and at that time the boys all wore uniforms, and they had these kind of military hats, and on their hats there was one of two slogans, and one slogan was "통일," which means unification. So the students would say to me every time, "통일," or the other alternative slogan on there was "멸공." And I was still learning Korean, and I said, well, I looked it up, does that mean destroy communism? I was told, no, as we flipped through, we used to have dictionaries in those days, not destroy, annihilate, exterminate, 멸공. And I say that because I think I also want to recall that in that Cold War period, this was an existential approach that, one or the other was going to win or lose this. And it wasn't clear at that time, given South Korea's and South and North Korea's relatively similar level of economic development, and South Korea's still searching for, shall we say, political legitimacy. It was not at all clear how that would all come out. But as we jump forward into this period where I think Dr. Frank has really done some excellent research and thinking of in that post-Cold War period, where you begin to have a sense that we're marking actually this year, next year, with President Moon Jae-in being at the UN, the two rival states actually now joining the UN in 1992. The sense that even though the DPRK then went through this very difficult time, that it came out and survived, and that maybe rather than 멸공, there was going to be a more gradual approach to the issue of unification, but it was going to continue to be a priority, at least certainly in constitutional terms and in state terms, both certainly for South Korea and for North Korea. And I think it is worth remembering that in South Korea, there has been and there remains a Ministry of Unification, which is not in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, although I've heard South Koreans debate this as attitudes about where does the relationship fit in. And that's where a lot of planning occurs. And one thing, and this gets me into now planning and predictions and you know, the US ROK alliance and how we look at it. It always struck me as interesting that very, very few American diplomats, and dare I say, planning is different in the military, but I think probably not too many in the US military establishment knew about Korea, knew that the Ministry of Unification, I mean, they had vast plans. They may be like a lot of other plans, they would never sort of relate to contact with reality, but they had lots and lots of plans. But with respect to US diplomacy, you know, first of all, I have to say, as a veteran of the State Department, we always were told, and it's still true, I think, Bryan, that there are fewer US diplomats than there are US military planners. There are also fewer US diplomats than there are military band members. And I'm not saying that in any sense of you know, just as a fact, that planning was not a strong suit in US diplomacy. It really was about reacting to what is before us. And in fact, George Kennan, that legendary figure some of you remember, was the person who actually established a policy planning office in the State Department in 1947. It continues there, and it continues to have perhaps a staff of about, I'd say maybe 10 to 20 people. So, you know, it's not the kind of place where you get into the kind of granular plans or the short-term plans about what's going to happen, but where then do we think about these strategic questions of not only, you know, how do we think about what the future might hold, but how do we begin to position ourselves in a way that allows us to deal with it in a wise and prudent way and to carry out our responsibilities. I would say there's a few, and this takes me to my third point, or my third area I just wanted to touch briefly on, and that is what I think should guide US policymakers and perhaps in other countries as well as we look at the future of the Korean Peninsula and where we are now. And I do think the work that Dr. Frank and others like him have done have been very, very important, because I've heard lots and lots of conversations over the years trying to look for comparisons. I've served in other divided places. I've written some articles about lessons to be learned from the Northern Ireland peace process, another divided place. And I never thought I would say that Ireland may be reunited before Korea is, but if today's newspapers are any guide, which may not be to predictions, that may be the case. In any event, as Bryan says, it may not be a choice either. And that's the other thing I think we have to realize about the Korean Peninsula. But in terms of principles, I think a key principle that the US and certainly our ally, the ROK, and I think most of the international community, if you like, agrees on, is that a war on the Korean Peninsula would be a disaster. And that reunification is something that we hope will come gradually. And second point, and this is in a way the most important one, should be decided by the Korean people themselves. Now, that's the kind of thing diplomats love to say, and especially if they're American diplomats, people probably think they don't really mean it. I think we have to really mean it. By the Korean people themselves, as decided in democratic ways, and in the context of what I would consider to be international standards, standards of human rights, of what the expectation would be of being a citizen of this world, even in the difficult time we're in the 21st century. So I would imagine that a reunified, or a Korea moving towards reunification, is going to look, shall I say, more like South Korea than North Korea, but it wouldn't look like South Korea now. And I think that's where some Americans would also have to think a bit about what that might imply in terms of some long-held conventional wisdom about our own relationship with South Korea and our own role in the neighborhood. Notwithstanding the fact that I think it clearly needs to be a future decided by the Korean people, that Korean Peninsula, the shrimp among the whales, is going to need the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of neighboring states. And the US, I think, has a responsibility, given its history and its role in Korea, to work on achieving that. I would say another principle is that while we need to be informed by the past, and you can see I'm very preoccupied with it, we can't be blinded by precedent either. And I think we really have to have a deeper understanding of how we are in a time of, to use that cliche, kind of tectonic plates are shifting in terms of power relationships, and that is going to affect the Korean Peninsula. But for now, I think what we're on, and what we've been on for a number of years, and with I think more failure than success, is a process that I think has to have, with respect to the US position, our allies in South Korea, clearly in the closest possible consultation. I think one lesson we learned from the previous administration in the United States is that you cannot have a policy towards North Korea that combines a disdain for the alliance and a disdain for the views and the leadership of South Korea with a determination that you're going to deliver some kind of transformation in North Korea. These things have to go together from, I think, from a US perspective and also from a Korean one. We had President Biden calling for what he called relentless diplomacy in a variety of fields at the UN just 2 days ago. I think it is going to take relentless diplomacy, and it's going to take our readiness to ask questions and open the window, if you like, the Overton window of what futures might look like in a way that I think is very difficult in government. And that's why I think gatherings like this in academia and think tanks are important. What is the future of the US-South Korea alliance? Must there be troops on the peninsula in a reunified Korea? Again, these are questions for the Korean people. Are there, where does China fit into this? I think that these are all questions that need greater debate. And I also welcome, as I said, the kind of work that on the economic side that Dr. Frank has been doing, and the way that's opened the window, I think, again, in South Korea to thinking about what are the economic costs. And it's my kind of final point is a comment on his. I mean, I think it's a direct result of some of the things that he and others have done, that we've had successive South Korean leaders begin to talk more, whether they're from the conservative or the progressive side of the spectrum, about some of the economic benefits that might come from a reconciliation and eventual reunification. As well as some of the challenges and costs that the government in Seoul would face in any scenario, whether it be a more gradual one or a more extreme one. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for allowing me to join you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Stevens. And every time we interact, I learn something new and interesting about the way Korea was well before I got there. I also taught at a middle school as my first experience in Korea, but they were not wearing military uniforms, and they definitely did not have tongil across all of their hats, which would have been very interesting. Much more reminiscent to things that I've seen in North Korea than in the South Korea that I first arrived in 2005. Well, we will open it up to questions from our audience. Please use the chat, or please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. But in the meantime, while people are gathering their thoughts, I would like a question that's just occurring to me as I'm listening to all of your presentations. And that is, the policies that the United States is pursuing right now towards North Korea, especially in the realm of economic sanctions and sort of pressure on the regime, are they cutting off some sort of unification scenarios that might be more desirable? I mean, in the effort to constrict the Kim regime's access to luxury goods and to restrict trade, are we making the road to unification perhaps more bumpy? And is there a way to pursue policies that both try to deter North Korea from behavior, which not just the United States, but basically most of the rest of the world says is unacceptable, but without cutting off maybe better options for unification down the road? And I wonder if either of you have thoughts on whether our policies right now might make unification more difficult, or how could they be adjusted? And I'll throw that open to any of you who have any thoughts on that. Dr. Frank, please.
Well, if I may, because that's one of the things I also talk about quite a lot, and I'll try to really make this short, which is not so easy. Frankly, having experienced life on the other side of the Iron Curtain in East Germany, it's absolutely striking to me how the West in general and the US in particular is not simply repeating a strategy that has worked so brilliantly well before 1990. And that is engagement, shower them with dollars, encourage anything that will promote corruption, that will make people more hungry, more greedy, that will increase pressure by the population on the leadership to even expand economic opportunities and so on and so on. Of course, I know North Korea now is not Europe in the mid 70s or 80s, of course not, but the principle is pretty much the same. It is inhabited by humans. And What we have seen in North Korea in the last 20 years, at least, has been a remarkable trend towards marketization. I'm reluctant to call it reforms. It's not comparable to China. There hasn't been a central decision by the leadership as announced by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, but de facto, they have done quite a lot. And many people have published about this endlessly. So this is pretty well documented. We have seen North Korea's society being transformed through these measures. This is where I compare North Korea as I see it today with North Korea as I saw it in 1991. And those are really almost two different societies that we are talking about here. And you would think that a strategy that has already worked, that has a chance to continue working in North Korea, you would think that this is actually pursued, but it is not. And I think by limiting North Korea's chances for having economic exchange with the outside world, we kind of strengthen the regime. We drive people back into the arms of the state, because if they want something and they cannot acquire that through the market, they have to acquire it through the state. The state requires loyalty, so you need political capital to actually get that. Yeah, I do not think that this is very wise, and I do not think that this is helping our objectives. I understand the way, of course, how these sanctions have been created. I mean, we have to respond to what North Korea is doing. And the other option would be an invasion. And of course, if I would have to choose between sanctions and the military option, I'm always happy to go for sanctions. But in any case, they are not very helpful. And my final point on that, I also think that sanctions are not targeting the right area. Our sanctions try to achieve denuclearization, and this is not working for a number of reasons. If sanctions would try to achieve more of an opening and liberalization of North Korea, think about the Helsinki process, for example, where something like a quid pro quo has happened in this regard, or even improvement of human rights or something, I think they would have a much higher chance of success. So therefore, by the very design, but also the way how they're implemented, sanctions are not a very good idea. They are not working, and they're actually counterproductive from my perspective.
I mean, I would just add, I'm in large agreement with Dr. Frank on this. I think that's what we've seen. Now, of course, we're seeing in North Korea a period over the last year or so when they have self-sanctioned themselves or isolated themselves to such a degree that in a way the sanctions have become somewhat irrelevant, I think, to the challenges they face now. But nonetheless, I think that the approach now is that there are certain sanctions that have been put on by the UN Security Council, which I think will remain there absent some move towards constraint on the nuclear side and progress towards a reduction of the nuclear and missile threat. Those are kind of UNSCR mandates now. But within that, I do think that the scope for inter-Korean and humanitarian activities should and could be expanded, and that should be the priority. And I also think that, again, the sanctions themselves, I mean, you've got the North Koreans to kind of come out and do this, but do not prohibit the kinds of exchanges, which again, the pandemic has, but consistent with our experience in Europe and elsewhere is, let's bring people out. I have no problem with the sons and daughters. They may be the elites of Pyongyang. If we can get them to go to Europe or Singapore or even the United States, for a few months and study and start businesses, I'm all for it.
Thank you. Bryan, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's not, entirely common, but it's actually really nice when you can say, like, for example, with what Professor Frank offered, I don't think there's a single thing he said I disagree with. I think that, it's incredibly well stated also with Ambassador Stevens. If I were to try and maybe put a bit of a characterization on it, a little bit of a bumper sticker, which I know the ambassador knows that we love to do, in the military, bumper sticker and acronym things to death. But, we talk a lot about pressure and a lot about sanctions, and we probably really need to be thinking more about inducements and persuasion. We get in our own way because of the nuclear issue. And, to some extent, it's understandable that we're concerned about it. It's just hard for us to get out of the traps that we sort of placed for ourselves and how we adopt a hard line on these kinds of issues, and that hard line constricts what not only we're willing to do, but even the ways that we're willing to talk about it. There's other challenges too, obviously, in both countries, South Korea and the United States. We have political systems, that work pretty much on 4 or 5 year cycles, depending on which of the two countries you're talking about. And so if you're talking about the kinds of approaches that I think we need, and I think Professor Frank laid out quite a few of them, it's a lot harder to do that in a single administration when you have someone coming in, they're looking at maybe by the time they're appointed a 3-year time horizon until they're looking at another election cycle, potentially being out of a job, and they want to accomplish something in those 3 years. And I think that's been one of our biggest challenges, is that this is not a 3-year issue. It didn't certainly come about in 3 years. It's not going to be solved in 3 years, to the extent that even there, we probably shouldn't be thinking about this as a problem, or a problem for that matter that has a solution. It's a situation, there's a different condition that's desired by probably a majority of people, with the exception of North Korea's elites, that a change would occur that would be stabilizing and open up North Korea, so the people could get a better government, no matter whose it happens to be. And we could kind of go on from there into hopefully a better future, one that would be hard to achieve, but over time you probably could. In the chat, somebody brought up, this idea of this dramatic change not really being the case, but something that unfolds over time, which I think is actually what we've been seeing. It just hasn't unfolded in as positive a direction as we would hope. But, North Korea today is very different from what it was, I would contend, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Generation change is a fact. Professor Frank talked about it. We're all humans. We love to focus on the differences we have, but really we have more in common usually than we have that is different. And so, I spent 6 years working with North Korean defectors and folks who've been captured in 2 different tours. And, you can say that North Koreans, they love their kids. They want a better life for themselves. They want stability, in many cases, predictability. They want opportunities. These things I think are probably true of humans everywhere. And whatever that we could do that would provide more of those things is likely to incentivize the kind of stable change that we probably all hope for. I think pressure, on the other hand, you're just pressuring a closed system, and it's going to burst out someplace else, and probably not where we would expect, and almost certainly not how we'd want. So again, I'd rather get into something that looks a lot more that's persuasive and not pressuring, that's kind of seductive and not sanctioning, for that matter, to people in terms of what they would hold for their own futures. And then finally, we should also be under no illusions, though, that who's going to go first to make the dramatic change in North Korea, in a sense, at a leadership level or even at a civic level. That is a very wrought proposition. And, most folks up there, I think that's how they feel trapped. On the other hand, if you want them to make incremental changes in their life that improves their circumstances, that's a different conversation. And I think that's more the one that we need to have. We provide for a society in a sense that can then make different choices, as opposed to trying to impose those choices on their leadership.
Thank you, Bryan. And thank you also for mentioning the question in the chat. And it's a very good question. And I want to just direct part of it to Professor Frank as well. The question was dramatic change. Dramatic change in regime is sometimes assumed to be a precursor for unification. But is this necessarily the case? Assuming that change in the North Korean regime may occur over time rather than suddenly, is it possible that capital investment may come before open borders and full exchange? And the reason I wanted to direct this to you, Dr. Frank, is it seems to me that North Korea was having difficulty attracting capital investment well before the nuclear program, which had to do with the failure to repay certain loans, largely from Europe in the 1970s and 1980s. What do you think it would take to attract foreign capital to North Korea today, assuming that somehow it was permitted under sanctions? It seems to me that removing the sanctions will only allow us to address some of those other issues. What is your perspective on that?
Well, to start with, any scenario that involves removing the sanctions is actually not really worth our time, because it's just not going to happen. But anyway, I'm getting your point. So in terms of an intellectual experiment, why not? Well, I've been preaching almost since the 90s that we shouldn't really not treat North Korea as special. We should treat them normally. And that works both ways. We shouldn't really build extra obstacles for them. But I also think we shouldn't really send them any free lunches and goodies, because then they will get used to it too. And if you ever negotiated with the North Koreans, you know that. I mean, they expect you to pay for everything and to treat them with the utmost respect that they usually do not do very much for. This is a result of our past policies. So I am relatively critical of showering them with presents, whether that is possible under sanctions or not. I would say, as a conclusion, what it takes to invest in North Korea is if they provide the necessary conditions that are attractive for investors. And that means that you can, of course, make a profit, that you do not face the destiny of Orascom or Cheo Technologies from Egypt, where you basically have your business in North Korea and can't repatriate your profits, where you have no intellectual property rights concerns, where you do not worry about the sudden nationalization of your business, and so on and so on. That's really all. Treating them as a normal country, treating them with the necessary respect, means that we also apply the same yardsticks to them as to everybody else. I do not think we need to have a special program designed for North Korea.
All right, thank you very much. And please, if you have your questions, ask them in the chat or the Q&A. I would like to take the opportunity to pose another question to any of our panelists. It seems to me that any plan to deal with this, or any planning, has to be multifaceted and have many different aspects to it. But there's only so much bandwidth with the arguments that you can make. There's only so much, any government in the ROK or in the United States can do without popular support, without maybe pressure from their constituents to say this is an issue that we need to be preparing for. So what do you think is if you had to boil it down to one thing that we could do now to perhaps ease a unification scenario in the future in terms of preparing the populace or the citizens of the US or the ROK to understand, what would that one thing be, and how would you make that argument?
Well, I see Professor Frank's already got his hand up, so.
Oh, go ahead, Bryan.
I had a train of thought, and it kind of fizzled out on me a little bit, if you're trying to really kind of boil this down. But I think I might start with something that Professor Frank talked about, which is trying to move our thinking about North Korea away from so many different ways that we've liked to describe them before, pariah state or rogue regime, whatever the case is, and start thinking about them as a country. And then maybe, that will set you on a basis to have a different kind of conversation in society. But I think the bottom line for me is you would have to start talking about this in South Korea differently. You'd have to get away from many of the slogans in the past, for example, and away from, the perennial debates about, for example, the defense white paper, where or not North Korea is characterized as the main enemy. I mean, there's any number of different ways that are manifest in terms of, an historically laden and not necessarily in a positive way set of depictions. We have the same things here in the United States, the ways that we've seen even our presidents characterize North Korean leaders. It's not helpful. It makes a caricature out of the situation. And I think that would be the first thing that I would try to do, because I think also on the South Korean side in particular, there increasingly is a willingness to even contemplate a permanent state of division. I think amongst some people, at least permanent in the sense that I hear very few people say, I really like to see this thing resolved in my lifetime. I think people increasingly are willing to say, sounds great, let's have it as a long-term project, and perhaps, when it finally happens, I'm not even around. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. If that should be the way that people, as Ambassador Stevens mentions, in Korea want to go, as long as people have a relatively free and transparent way to make that set of choices, then, the rest of us ought to let it be. And I think we just have to change, some back up the way that we talk about North Korea and think about it. And that should trend more towards something that's, I hate to use a term, but normal, instead of having it be this outlier that has us talk about options in some rather crazy ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryan. Professor Frank.
Yeah, I would have one directed more at South Korea and one directed at North Korea. For South Korea, I would certainly suggest something that has already been started. I think that needs to be expanded. That's a unification fund. You can run this like a pension fund, so you manage it well, you know, you generate your profits, and then you just see it growing until that really unspecified moment when eventually unification will happen, and then you will need the money. It's not something that you do after unification, where you then start worrying about collecting all the necessary funds. I mean, I didn't really say that there will no transfers be necessary. I just said they do not count as losses, but the transfers will have to be done. So why not collecting money now? Again, I know this is taking place, but I would intensify that. The one thing that I would also do if I was South Korea, tell the North Korean elite that they have an exit option. Because if I would be someone sitting somewhere high up in the party or in the military or in government in North Korea, I would really wonder what happens to me after unification. And you know, you mentioned your experience from the 1970s, and I don't think we really have to go back that far with slogans like, you know, let's kill the communists or let's kill the Reds or whatever, how you call them, the Balgengi, you know. That's still a swear word, and you really don't use that. People are still scared of being called communists. So some kind of legally binding assurance that it is not punishable to be a party member, for example. It is not punishable to be a military officer in the Korean People's Army. That would be helpful, because the North Koreans have actually looked at German unification and they saw this kind of a witch hunt taking place, which again, in Germany, wasn't really that bad. But look at Ceausescu, that's usually the example that is used quite a lot. You know, he ended up being shot. And if you want to have support amongst the North Korean elite for some kind of reconciliation and the path that might eventually lead to an adjustment of the system in unification, then first of all, you have to calm their worries. And I think the South Koreans could do that. I know it's not easy and it requires a long discussion. But hey, now you have the time for that. You know, unification is not really visible next week or something. So just do it. And the North Koreans, you don't even have to send them leaflets. I'm pretty sure they have ways of figuring out what you guys talk about. Thank you.
Ambassador Stevens.
Yeah, obviously, I think those are all excellent points. I mean, I remain a little skeptical that the North Korean ruling class will be reassured, or at least the Kim family itself. But I think it's worth trying. I would just add to this kind of mix. I think it is important with respect to South Korea that the South Korean body politic and the people of South Korea continue to feel assured that there is an effective commitment and deterrence, and that they are secure. We've talked about the inefficacy of sanctions, and I agree with much. Well, I chimed in on that as well. I do think it's important that that South Korea continue to feel that the United States has a commitment there to its survival and to maintaining and to deterring a war on the peninsula. But that is not inconsistent. In fact, I think that supports the kind of outreach we're talking about. With respect to the United States, David, since you mentioned kind of public attitudes in the United States, I think it's a very interesting story, in that mostly I think because of South Korea's own success and rise, and because there is kind of an awareness almost of in the United States that South Korea, for all the challenges in the relationship, has been this great success. And Americans take a little pride in it, and I think are more willing, to try to see, okay, what do South Koreans really think about this? I mean, I actually recall when President George W. Bush was in office as president, he came in with a very hard line on North Korea and the axis of evil and post 9/11. It was his contact with first Kim Dae-jung, had a summit that went very badly, and then with Roh Moo-hyun, who said, we actually have to have a peace regime. This is something we're working on, and we need your help. And he persuaded President George W. Bush. I think that was because of President Bush's growing kind of respect for the fact that Koreans have their own reality too. And Americans aren't too good at realizing that sometimes, but I think that we've moved a lot further in that direction with respect to both our official and kind of broader relationship with South Korea because of South Korea's own attention to the relationship and success. And the fact that a lot of our ideas haven't actually worked out so well.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Professor Frank, Mr. Port, and Ambassador Stevens for today's enlightening discussion. I also want to thank the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Chicago for their generous support of this conference. I would also like to thank the Korean Defense Veterans Association for their promotional support. This conference was also partially funded by a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Education, and I encourage all of you to join us for the next 2 sessions on 28 September and 6 October. Full details of those sessions can be found at eastasia.wisc.edu/KORUS. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you there. Good afternoon, everyone.